The mess hall conversation stopped mid-sentence when Captain Valdez raised his voice. "You think you can just walk around here like you own the place, soldier?" His finger jabbed toward the young woman standing near the coffee station, her digital camouflage uniform bearing no visible rank insignia. She was smaller than most of the personnel around her, maybe 5'4", with dark hair pulled back in regulation style. Several Marines at nearby tables turned to watch, forks pausing halfway to their mouths. Private First Class Chun whispered to his table mate, "Here we go again. Captain's on another power trip." The woman at the coffee station remained perfectly still, her posture straight but relaxed, hands clasped behind her back in a position that suggested military training, but nothing more to the casual observer. Captain Valdez stepped closer, his boots echoing against the polished floor. "I ask you a question, soldier. When a superior officer addresses you, you respond with proper military courtesy. Do I need to remind you of basic protocol?" His voice carried across the mess hall, designed to humiliate and establish dominance in front of the assembled personnel. The woman's response came quietly, barely audible to those nearby. "No, sir, that won't be necessary." Before we continue with this story, take a moment to drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Military families and bases are common in many communities, and perhaps you've witnessed similar displays of authority in your area. Captain Valdez's face flushed red at what he perceived as insufficient deference. "That's not how you address an officer. You will stand at attention when I'm speaking to you." The mess hall had gone completely silent now. 60 pairs of eyes watching the confrontation unfold. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work, peering through the service windows to observe the scene. The woman straightened slightly, but didn't assume the rigid attention position Valdez demanded. "Sir, I was simply getting coffee before my next appointment. I meant no disrespect." "Your next appointment?" Valdez laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "What appointment could a soldier like you possibly have that's more important than showing proper respect to your superiors?" He stepped even closer, invading her personal space in a way that made several onlookers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Sergeant Mills at table 7 leaned toward his companion. "This isn't right, man. Captain's way out of line here." But nobody moved to intervene. Captain Valdez had a reputation for explosive anger and career-ending grudges against those who crossed him. The woman remained calm, her breathing steady despite the obvious tension in the room. "Sir, I understand your concern about protocol. Perhaps we could discuss this privately, rather than disrupting the mess hall." This suggestion only seemed to enrage Valdez further. "Don't you dare tell me how to handle military discipline. You clearly need a lesson in respect, and everyone here needs to see what happens when proper authority is challenged." His hand moved toward the woman's shoulder, as if to physically demonstrate his point. What happened next occurred so quickly that many witnesses would later struggle to describe the exact sequence of events. Captain Valdez's hand struck the woman across the face with enough force to snap her head to the side. The sound of the impact resonated through the suddenly silent mess hall like a gunshot. The woman absorbed the blow without stepping backward, her hand rising slowly to touch the reddening mark on her cheek. When she looked back at Captain Valdez, her expression remained remarkably composed, though something had changed in her eyes. Something that made several of the more experienced personnel in the room suddenly sit up straighter in their chairs. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound was the distant hum of the air conditioning system, and Captain Valdez's heavy breathing as he stood over the woman he had just assaulted, his chest puffed out with the satisfaction of having established his dominance in front of an audience. The woman straightened her uniform jacket with deliberate precision, her movements controlled and purposeful. "Thank you for the demonstration, Captain. I believe that will be sufficient for now." Her voice carried no trace of anger or fear, only a quiet certainty that made more than one observer wonder exactly who they had just watched get struck. As she turned to leave the mess hall, Several people noticed details they had missed before. The way she carried herself, the confidence in her stride, despite what had just occurred, the fact that while her uniform bore no visible rank, there were small indicators that suggested this might not be the ordinary soldier Captain Valdez believed he had just disciplined. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez couldn't shake what he had witnessed in the mess hall. 23 years in the Corps had taught him to recognize when something was seriously wrong. And watching Captain Valdez strike that woman had triggered every alarm bell in his experienced mind. He found himself walking toward the base communication center, his pace quickening with each step. The woman had left the mess hall with a composure that bothered Rodriguez more than tears or anger would have. Most personnel would have filed a complaint, or at least shown some emotional response to being publicly humiliated and assaulted by a superior officer. Instead, she had simply straightened her uniform and walked away like someone who knew exactly what would happen next. Rodriguez pushed open the door to the communications center where Corporal Hayes was monitoring radio traffic. "Hayes, I need you to run a personnel check for me. Quiet-like." The corporal looked up from his console, noting the serious expression on the staff sergeant's face. "What kind of check, Staff Sergeant?" "There was a woman in the mess hall about 20 minutes ago. Captain Valdez had an altercation with her. Digital camo, no visible rank, dark hair in regulation style. About 5'4", maybe 130. Rodriguez described her as precisely as his memory allowed. "Any unit designation or identifying marks?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Rodriguez replied, staring out the window toward the mess hall. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. In his experience, when someone took a hit like that and showed no reaction, it usually meant they had resources the aggressor didn't know about. Hayes frowned at his screen. "Staff Sergeant, I'm not finding anyone matching that description in our active duty roster. Could she be visiting from another base?" Rodriguez felt his stomach tighten. That would explain the lack of visible rank insignia, but open up other possibilities he wasn't sure he wanted to consider. Try the distinguished visitor log. Check recent arrivals, especially anyone with security clearances. The typing resumed, more urgent now. Hayes understood that tone in his staff sergeant's voice. It meant potential trouble that could reach far beyond their small communication center. After several minutes of searching, Hayes looked up with an expression that confirmed Rodriguez's growing concerns. "Staff Sergeant, there's a security flag on this search. I can see there's someone here matching that general description, but the details are restricted above my clearance level." Hayes's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "The file shows arrival yesterday, but everything else requires colonel-level access or higher." Rodriguez closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. In 23 years, he had learned that security flags usually meant one of two things. The person was either very important or very dangerous, sometimes both. Either way, Captain Valdez had just made what might be a career-ending mistake. "Can you tell who authorized the visit?" Hayes scrolled through the available information. "The authorization code traces back to Pentagon level, but that's all I can access. Whatever this is, it came from way up the chain." He paused, then added quietly, "Staff Sergeant, should I log this inquiry?" Rodriguez considered the question carefully. Logging the search would create a paper trail that might protect them later, but it would also alert higher-ups that someone was asking questions about their mysterious visitor. On the other hand, if this woman was as important as the security flag suggested, those higher-ups probably already knew about the incident. "Log it," Rodriguez decided. "Note that we were responding to a potential security concern involving unauthorized physical contact with a restricted visitor. Make sure the timestamp shows we initiated this inquiry within 30 minutes of the incident." As Hayes typed the official log entry, Rodriguez found himself thinking about Captain Valdez. The man was ambitious and aggressive, qualities that had served him well in combat, but made him dangerous in garrison settings. Valdez had a tendency to assert his authority without considering consequences, and this time He might have asserted it against the wrong person. The communications center door opened, and Lieutenant Morrison entered, looking unusually tense. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I need to speak with you immediately." The lieutenant's formal tone suggested this wasn't a casual conversation. Rodriguez followed Morrison to a corner of the room where they could speak without Hayes overhearing. "What's going on, Lieutenant?" Morrison kept his voice low. "I just received a call from Colonel Patterson's office. Apparently there was an incident in the mess hall that requires immediate attention. The colonel wants to see everyone who witnessed what happened, and he specifically asked for you by name." The knot in Rodriguez's stomach tightened further. How did the colonel already know about this? The incident had happened less than an hour ago, and Rodriguez was certain no one had filed an official report yet. "I don't know," Morrison replied. But he seemed to know exactly what had occurred. He mentioned something about reviewing security footage and interviewing key personnel. "Rodriguez, what exactly did you see in that mess hall?" Rodriguez looked back at Corporal Hayes, who was still working at his terminal, then at Lieutenant Morrison's worried face. He saw a captain make what might be the biggest mistake of his military career. And now it looked like the consequences were already cascading down from levels far above their small base. Colonel Patterson stared at the classified file on his computer screen, his face growing paler with each line he read. The photograph matched perfectly with the woman his security cameras had captured being struck by Captain Valdez in the mess hall. The rank designation next to her name made his hands tremble slightly as he reached for his secure phone. Major General Elizabeth Chun, United States Marine Corps, daughter of 4-star General Robert Chun, current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The file continued with a service record that read like a legend: Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Purple Heart, with 3 oak leaf clusters, and combat tours in 3 different theaters. She was currently assigned to the Pentagon as Deputy Director of Special Operations. Patterson's aide, Captain Williams, knocked on the doorframe. "Sir, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is here as requested. Should I send him in?" "Give me 2 minutes, then yes," Patterson replied, still staring at the screen. He was trying to process how one of his company commanders had just physically assaulted a major general. Not just any major general, but the daughter of the most powerful military officer in the United States. The colonel picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he had never hoped to use. The voice that answered was crisp and efficient. "Pentagon Operations Center. This is Colonel Myers." "This is Colonel Patterson at Camp Meridian. I need to speak with General Chun immediately regarding his daughter." Patterson's voice was steady, despite the chaos in his mind. "Hold one moment, sir." The line went silent for nearly 30 seconds before a new voice came on. This was a voice that commanded instant attention from anyone in uniform. "This is General Chun. Colonel, I understand there's been an incident involving my daughter." Patterson closed his eyes and delivered the report that would end careers and potentially close his base. "Sir, approximately 1 hour ago, Captain Michael Valdez of Bravo Company physically struck Major General Chun in our mess hall. The assault was witnessed by approximately 60 personnel and captured on security cameras." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Patterson wondered if the connection had been lost. When General Chun finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but carried an undertone that made Patterson grateful they were speaking over the phone rather than face to face. Captain Williams sent Staff Sergeant Rodriguez in as Colonel Patterson was ending his call with the Pentagon. Rodriguez stood at attention, his 23 years of experience telling him that whatever was happening was far beyond anything he had encountered before. "Staff Sergeant, what exactly did you witness in the mess hall?" Patterson's question was direct, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer and was simply confirming details for an official record. Rodriguez recounted the incident precisely, from Captain Valdez's initial confrontation to the moment he struck the woman. As he spoke, he watched Colonel Patterson's expression grow increasingly grim. When Rodriguez finished his account, Patterson nodded slowly. "Staff Sergeant, I need you to understand that what you witnessed was an assault on a Major General. Not just any Major General, but Major General Elizabeth Chun, daughter of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff." Rodriguez felt his knees nearly buckle at this revelation. "Sir, I knew something was wrong when I saw her reaction to being hit. She took it like someone who knew exactly what was going to happen next." Patterson stood and walked to his window, looking out across the base that would likely be under federal investigation within hours. "Staff Sergeant, I'm placing you in charge of securing all personnel who witnessed the incident. No one leaves the base until they've been interviewed by the investigators who are already en route." As Rodriguez left the colonel's office, Patterson returned to his computer screen, where new messages were already appearing. The first was from General Chun's office, informing him that a team of 3 generals would be arriving within 4 hours to conduct an immediate investigation. The second message was from Pentagon Security, instructing him to preserve all evidence and prepare for a complete base lockdown. Captain Valdez, meanwhile, remained completely unaware of the storm approaching. He was in his quarters, writing up his version of the incident, for what he assumed would be a routine disciplinary action against an insubordinate soldier. In his report, he described his actions as necessary to maintain good order and discipline, confident that his superior officers would support his decision to physically correct a soldier who had shown insufficient respect. The base communications center was now buzzing with encrypted traffic, as Pentagon officials coordinated the response to what was already being classified as a major incident. Corporal Hayes watched the message traffic with growing alarm, understanding that the security flags he had discovered earlier were connected to something much larger than a simple personnel dispute. Colonel Patterson received his final call of the afternoon from his immediate superior at Marine Corps headquarters. The conversation was brief and to the point. Preserve all evidence, cooperate fully with the investigating team, and prepare for the possibility that Camp Meridian would be temporarily shut down while the investigation proceeded. 3 hours after the incident, Captain Valdez was summoned to Colonel Patterson's office for what he believed would be a routine debrief about the disciplinary action he had taken in the mess hall. He walked across the base with confidence, having spent the afternoon convincing himself that his superiors would commend him for maintaining proper military standards. Valdez knocked on the colonel's door and entered when called. "Sir, Captain Michael Valdez, reporting as ordered." He stood at attention, his uniform immaculate, and his bearing suggesting he expected praise rather than criticism. Colonel Patterson looked up from a stack of papers that had been growing throughout the afternoon. These were preliminary reports, witness statements, and most damning of all, still photographs taken from the security camera footage showing the exact moment Valdez's hand made contact with Major General Chun's face. "Captain Valdez, please describe for me exactly what occurred in the mess hall this afternoon." Patterson's voice was carefully neutral, giving no indication of the storm that was about to break over his subordinate's head. Valdez began his account with obvious pride. "Sir, I observed a soldier displaying improper military courtesy and failing to show appropriate respect when addressed by a superior officer. When verbal correction proved insufficient, I deemed it necessary to provide immediate physical discipline to reinforce proper standards of conduct." Patterson listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. As Valdez continued his self-incriminating account, the colonel found himself amazed that an officer could be so thoroughly unaware of the magnitude of his error. "Captain, did you make any attempt to verify this soldier's identity before taking physical action?" Valdez seemed confused by the question. "Sir, she was clearly a junior enlisted person, no visible rank insignia, and her failure to show proper respect confirmed her status. I saw no need for further verification before maintaining good order and discipline." At that moment, Captain Williams knocked on the door and entered with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Sir, we have 3 helicopters approaching from the northeast. Pentagon markings. ETA 15 minutes. Patterson dismissed Williams and turned back to Valdez, who was beginning to show the first signs of uncertainty. "Captain, I need you to understand something very important. The person you struck in the mess hall was not a junior enlisted soldier. She was Major General Elizabeth Chun, daughter of General Robert Chun, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff." The color drained from Valdez's face so quickly that Patterson thought he might collapse. The captain's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he had just learned. "Sir, that's impossible. She had no rank insignia. She didn't identify herself. How was I supposed to know?" Patterson stood and walked to his window, where the approaching helicopters were now visible in the distance. "Captain, ignorance is not a defense for assaulting a general officer. The fact that you failed to verify her identity before taking physical action only compounds the severity of your offense." The first helicopter touched down on the base landing pad with military precision. 3 men in dress uniforms emerged, their bearing and the deference shown by the ground crew making it clear that these were very senior officers. Patterson recognized the lead figure from photographs, Lieutenant General Harrison, the Pentagon's senior investigator for major incidents involving general officers. Valdez had sunk into a chair, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Sir, what happens now?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Now, Captain, you will remain in your quarters under house arrest until the investigating team is ready to interview you. You are not to discuss this incident with anyone except the investigating officers and your assigned legal counsel." Patterson turned from the window to face his subordinate. "Captain, I want you to understand that this is no longer a matter of military discipline. This is a federal assault case involving a general officer." The second helicopter disgorged a team of military police investigators, their equipment cases suggesting they were prepared for an extensive investigation. The third helicopter carried what appeared to be a legal team, their briefcases and official bearing indicating that formal charges were already being prepared. Base personnel had gathered at a respectful distance to watch the unprecedented arrival of so much high-ranking attention. Word was spreading quickly through the base that something extraordinary had occurred, though most still didn't understand the full scope of the situation. Captain Williams returned to escort Valdez to his quarters, where he would wait under guard until the investigating team was ready to begin formal proceedings. As they left the colonel's office, Valdez looked back with the expression of a man who finally understood that his military career was over. Patterson remained at his window, watching as the 3 generals and their support teams organized themselves with the efficiency that came from handling the most serious incidents in military justice. His phone rang again, this time with caller ID, showing it was General Chun himself calling for a second time. Lieutenant General Harrison strode into the base conference room with the bearing of a man who had handled the military's most sensitive investigations for over 2 decades. Behind him followed Major General Roberts and Brigadier General Martinez, their combined presence, representing more star power than Camp Meridian had seen in its entire operational history. Colonel Patterson stood at attention as the 3 generals entered, their aides immediately beginning to establish a command center for what would clearly be an extensive investigation. Harrison's first words set the tone for everything that would follow. "Colonel Patterson, I want you to understand that this investigation has the personal attention of the Secretary of Defense and the President. When a general officer is assaulted, it becomes a matter of national security as well as military justice." Harrison's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. The generals had reviewed the security footage during their flight to the base, and the crystal-clear images of Captain Valdez striking Major General Chun had left no room for interpretation or defense. What they needed now was to understand how such a catastrophic failure of command and control had been allowed to occur. Major General Roberts opened his briefcase and extracted a thick folder of preliminary reports. "Colonel, we've already spoken with Pentagon Security about Major General Chun's visit to your base. She was here conducting an unannounced inspection of your Special Operations training facilities as part of her duties as Deputy Director of Special Operations." Patterson felt his stomach drop. An unannounced inspection meant that Major General Chun had been evaluating his base's performance and readiness when she was assaulted by one of his officers. The implications for his own career were becoming clear. Brigadier General Martinez consulted his tablet and looked up at Patterson. "Colonel, according to our records, Captain Valdez has had 3 previous incidents involving excessive use of authority with subordinate personnel. Why was he still in a command position?" The question struck at the heart of Patterson's command failures. He had been aware of Valdez's aggressive tendencies, but had chosen to counsel rather than discipline him, believing that the captain's combat experience outweighed his personality issues. That decision now appeared catastrophically wrong. "Sir, Captain Valdez received counseling for those incidents, but they were deemed not severe enough to warrant formal disciplinary action." Patterson's explanation sounded weak, even to his own ears. Lieutenant General Harrison stood and walked to the window, overlooking the base. "Colonel, counseling clearly was insufficient. Your failure to take stronger action enabled today's assault on a general officer. This represents a fundamental breakdown in command responsibility." The investigation team's efficiency was impressive and terrifying. Within 2 hours of their arrival, they had interviewed 15 witnesses, reviewed all security footage, and begun constructing a timeline that would support formal charges against Captain Valdez and potentially Colonel Patterson himself. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was among the first witnesses called for formal testimony. As he recounted the incident under oath, the generals took detailed notes and asked pointed questions about the base's command climate and the frequency of such confrontations. Did Captain Valdez regularly use physical intimidation with personnel he perceived as subordinate? Major General Roberts asked. Rodriguez chose his words carefully. "Sir, the captain had a reputation for being heavy-handed with discipline. Most personnel tried to avoid situations where they might draw his attention." The generals exchanged meaningful looks. A pattern of aggressive behavior that culminated in assaulting a general officer suggested systemic problems that went beyond one captain's poor judgment. Meanwhile, Major General Chun herself had returned to the base at the request of the investigating team. She entered the conference room with the same composed demeanor she had shown in the mess hall, her presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone present. "Elizabeth," Lieutenant General Harrison said, using her first name to acknowledge both their professional relationship and the personal nature of the assault she had endured. "We need your official statement for the record." Major General Chun's account was precise and professional, delivered without emotion or editorializing. She described Captain Valdez's escalating aggression, his failure to verify her identity, and the deliberate nature of the physical assault. Her testimony was devastating in its calm objectivity. When asked why she hadn't immediately identified herself to prevent the escalation, her response revealed the deeper purpose of her visit to the base. "I was conducting an unannounced assessment of command climate and personnel interactions. Identifying myself would have invalidated the inspection and prevented me from observing actual conditions." The revelation that the assault had occurred during an official Pentagon inspection elevated the incident from a serious disciplinary matter to a potential court-martial offense, with implications for the entire base's operational status. As the afternoon progressed, the investigating team's preliminary findings painted a picture of command failure at multiple levels. Captain Valdez's assault was the culmination of a pattern of aggressive behavior that had been inadequately addressed by his superiors, creating an environment where such an incident became almost inevitable. By 1800 hours, Camp Meridian was under complete lockdown. Military police had positioned themselves at every gate, and no personnel were permitted to leave the base without explicit authorization from the investigating team. The entire facility had been transformed into what was effectively a crime scene under federal jurisdiction. Lieutenant General Harrison issued orders that reverberated through every department on the base. All training exercises were suspended immediately. All leave and liberty were canceled indefinitely. Every member of Bravo Company, Captain Valdez's unit, was restricted to quarters pending individual interviews with the investigation team. The base communications center had been taken over by Pentagon security specialists, who were monitoring all outgoing calls and electronic communications. Corporal Hayes watched nervously as federal investigators reviewed every message and transmission from the past 72 hours, looking for any indication that personnel might have been aware of Major General Chun's true identity. In the base legal office, Captain Susan Torres, the staff judge advocate, was briefing the investigating generals on the potential charges that could be filed against Captain Valdez. The list was extensive and carried severe penalties under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Assault on a superior commissioned officer, she began, reading from her legal manual. Under Article 90, this carries a maximum penalty of 5 years confinement and dismissal from service. Conduct unbecoming an officer under Article 133 adds additional penalties if we include the federal assault charges for striking a general officer. Captain Valdez could face civilian prosecution as well. Major General Roberts nodded grimly. Captain Torres, we also need to consider charges against Colonel Patterson for failure to maintain proper command climate and negligent supervision of his subordinate officers. The legal implications were staggering. An entire base command structure was under investigation, and the potential for multiple court-martials was becoming increasingly likely with each witness interview. In his quarters, Captain Valdez sat under guard, finally comprehending the magnitude of his actions. He had requested permission to call his wife, but that request was denied pending completion of the initial investigation. His military counsel, Major Frank Davidson, had arrived from the regional legal office and was reviewing the preliminary charges. Captain, Major Davidson said quietly, I need you to understand that this is the most serious case I've handled in 20 years of military law. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the political implications are extraordinary. Valdez stared at the wall, his career flashing before his eyes. How was I supposed to know who she was? She looked like any other soldier. She didn't identify herself. Major Davidson shook his head. Captain, that's not a legal defense. You assaulted someone without verifying their identity or authority. Under military law, that's inexcusable, regardless of who the victim turned out to be. Meanwhile, the investigation team was discovering additional problems that extended beyond the immediate assault. Their review of base records revealed multiple instances where Captain Valdez's aggressive behavior had been reported, but not properly documented or addressed through formal channels. Sergeant First Class Williams had filed 3 separate complaints about Valdez's conduct over the past 6 months, but each had been handled informally through verbal counseling rather than written reprimands. This pattern suggested a systemic failure to address problematic behavior before it escalated to criminal assault. Lieutenant General Harrison called Colonel Patterson into the conference room for his second formal interview of the day. Colonel, our investigation has revealed that you received multiple warnings about Captain Valdez's conduct. Why did you fail to take formal disciplinary action? Patterson's response revealed the flawed thinking that had enabled the crisis. Sir, Captain Valdez was an effective combat leader with 3 deployments and commendations for valor. I believed his garrison behavior issues could be corrected through counseling and leadership development. The general's expression made clear that this explanation was insufficient. Colonel, your job is to maintain good order and discipline. Your failure to address known problems with Captain Valdez directly enabled today's assault on a general officer. As evening approached, the full scope of the investigation was becoming apparent to everyone on the base. This was no longer just about one captain's poor judgment. It was about command failure, systemic problems with discipline and accountability, and the fundamental question of whether Camp Meridian's leadership was competent to maintain operational readiness. The base dining facility was eerily quiet during the evening meal, with personnel speaking in hushed tones about the unprecedented events unfolding around them. Many had witnessed similar confrontations from Captain Valdez in the past, and they were beginning to understand that their failure to report those incidents formally had contributed to the current crisis. Word was spreading that the investigation team had requested additional personnel from Pentagon security, and that the lockdown could continue for days or even weeks, while every aspect of the base's command climate was examined under federal scrutiny. General Robert Chun, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stood in his Pentagon office reviewing the preliminary investigation report that had arrived via secure transmission 20 minutes earlier. The photographs from the security footage were spread across his desk, each image showing a different angle of his daughter being struck by Captain Valdez. His aide, Colonel Morrison, entered with additional classified updates from Camp Meridian. "Sir, Lieutenant General Harrison reports that the investigation has uncovered systemic command failures beyond the immediate assault. He recommends expanding the inquiry to include the entire base leadership structure." General Chun's expression remained professionally controlled, but those who knew him well could see the barely contained fury behind his calm exterior. His daughter had been conducting an official Pentagon inspection when she was assaulted by an officer whose aggressive behavior had been repeatedly ignored by his superiors. "Get me Secretary Martinez on Secure Line 1, General Chun instructed. This has escalated beyond a military discipline issue. When a general officer conducting official duties is assaulted, it becomes a matter requiring the highest levels of attention." Within minutes, Secretary of Defense Martinez was on the line from his office across the Pentagon. The conversation was brief and decisive. The Secretary agreed that Camp Meridian would be placed under emergency federal oversight until the investigation was complete and all responsible parties were held accountable. Meanwhile, at Camp Meridian, the investigation team was preparing to interview Captain Valdez for the first time since his arrest. Major Davidson, his military counsel, had spent hours trying to prepare his client for questioning that would likely determine whether he faced court-martial or federal criminal charges. "Captain, when they ask you about your decision to strike Major General Chun, you must acknowledge that you failed to verify her identity and that your actions were inappropriate regardless of her rank." Major Davidson's voice carried the weight of someone delivering a death sentence to a career. Valdez sat in stunned silence, finally grasping that no explanation or justification would save him from the consequences of his actions. But she was acting like an insubordinate soldier. She didn't show proper respect. "How could I have known?" The major shook his head grimly. "Captain, those questions reveal exactly why you're facing these charges. A professional officer verifies identity before taking any disciplinary action, especially physical force. Your assumptions and prejudices led directly to this disaster." Lieutenant General Harrison was coordinating with Pentagon legal officials to ensure that all charges were properly structured to reflect the severity of the offense. The assault on Major General Chun was not just a violation of military law, but an attack on the institutional authority of the entire command structure. Brigadier General Martinez was reviewing witness statements that painted an increasingly damning picture of the command climate at Camp Meridian. Personnel after personnel described Captain Valdez as someone who used intimidation and physical presence to enforce his will. With Colonel Patterson either unaware or unwilling to address the pattern, the base chaplain, Major Williams, had been quietly counseling personnel who were struggling with the knowledge that they had witnessed criminal behavior. but failed to report it through proper channels. Many were questioning whether their silence had enabled the assault on Major General Chun. "I saw him grab Private Martinez by the shoulder last month," one soldier confided during an informal counseling session. "He was screaming in her face about her uniform appearance. I thought about reporting it, but everyone said that's just how Captain Valdez operates." The chaplain's notes from these sessions were becoming part of the investigation record, documenting a culture where aggressive behavior was normalized, and potential victims were afraid to seek help through official channels. At 1930 hours, General Chun made a second call to Camp Meridian, this time speaking directly with his daughter. "Elizabeth, how are you handling the situation?" His voice carried both parental concern and professional respect for her handling of an extraordinary circumstance. Major General Chun's response was characteristically composed. "Dad, I'm fine. The investigation team is thorough and professional. What concerns me more is what this incident reveals about command climate here. This wasn't an isolated event, but the culmination of a pattern that should have been addressed months ago." Her assessment aligned perfectly with the investigation team's preliminary findings. Captain Valdez's assault was not an aberration, but the predictable result of unchecked aggressive behavior that had been allowed to escalate over time. The evening news broadcasts were beginning to pick up reports of unusual military activity at Camp Meridian, though the Pentagon press office was refusing to provide details about the ongoing investigation. The base had become the focus of attention from the highest levels of government and military leadership. Colonel Patterson received word that he would be formally interviewed again the following morning, this time under oath and with full legal representation. His military counsel had already advised him that his career was likely over, regardless of the investigation's outcome. The base personnel were beginning to understand that they were witnessing history. Never before had a single incident resulted in such a massive federal response, with 3 generals conducting an investigation that could potentially result in the relief of an entire command structure. The morning of the second day brought federal prosecutors from the Department of Justice to Camp Meridian. Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Henderson arrived with a team of investigators, signaling that the incident had transcended military jurisdiction and entered the realm of federal criminal law. Lieutenant General Harrison briefed the federal team in the base conference room, laying out evidence that supported multiple felony charges against Captain Valdez. The assault on Major General Chun, during the performance of her official duties, constituted a federal offense that carried severe penalties under civilian law. "We have crystal clear video evidence of the assault," Henderson stated as she reviewed the security footage. "Combined with witness testimony and the victim's status as a general officer conducting official Pentagon business, this is one of the strongest cases I've seen for federal prosecution of military personnel." The arrival of federal prosecutors sent shockwaves through the base personnel. What had begun as a disciplinary incident was now a federal criminal case that could result in prison time for Captain Valdez and potentially others who had enabled his behavior through negligent supervision. Major Davidson met with his client to explain the new reality they faced. "Captain, the federal charges carry a maximum sentence of 10 years in federal prison, separate from any military court-martial. You're now facing both military and civilian prosecution for the same incident." Valdez had spent the night in his quarters coming to terms with the destruction of his career, but the prospect of federal prison was a devastating new development. His wife had been notified of his arrest, but was prohibited from visiting until the investigation was complete. Meanwhile, Colonel Patterson was facing his own legal crisis. His military counsel informed him that federal prosecutors were considering charges of negligent supervision and creating conditions that enabled the assault on a general officer. The colonel's failure to address Valdez's pattern of aggressive behavior was being viewed as criminal negligence. Major General Roberts was coordinating with Pentagon legal affairs to ensure that all evidence was properly preserved for both military and federal prosecution. The case had become a model for how the military would handle future assaults on general officers, setting precedents that would affect military justice for decades. At the Pentagon, General Chun was briefing senior leadership on the broader implications of the incident. The assault on his daughter had revealed systemic problems in base command structures that required immediate attention across all military installations. This incident demonstrates the critical importance of maintaining proper command climate and addressing problematic behavior before it escalates to criminal conduct, General Chun told the assembled Joint Chiefs. We cannot allow aggressive officers to operate without accountability simply because they have strong combat records. The investigation team had expanded their inquiry to include a comprehensive review of Camp Meridian's personnel files, training records, and disciplinary procedures. They discovered that Captain Valdez's aggressive behavior had been reported informally by multiple subordinates, but the base leadership had consistently failed to document or address these incidents through official channels. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was called for his second formal interview, this time with federal prosecutors present. His testimony about witnessing previous incidents of aggressive behavior from Captain Valdez was being used to establish a pattern that supported federal charges of habitual misconduct. How many times did you observe Captain Valdez using physical intimidation with subordinates? Assistant Attorney Henderson asked. Rodriguez counted carefully before responding. At least 6 incidents over the past year that I personally witnessed, ma'am. Each time personnel complained informally, but were discouraged from filing official reports. The pattern of unreported incidents was becoming central to the federal case. Prosecutors were arguing that the assault on Major General Chun was the inevitable result of allowing aggressive behavior to continue unchecked for months. Base Chaplain Major Williams provided additional evidence through his counseling records, documenting multiple personnel who had sought guidance about Captain Valdez's behavior, but were afraid to report it officially due to fear of retaliation. Private Martinez broke down during her interview, describing how Captain Valdez had physically grabbed her and screamed at her about uniform discrepancies. I was afraid to report it because everyone said he would make my life hell if I complained officially. The federal investigation was also examining Colonel Patterson's role in creating an environment where subordinates felt unable to report abuse through proper channels. His failure to establish effective reporting procedures was being viewed as a contributing factor to the assault. By late afternoon, Assistant Attorney Henderson announced that federal charges would be filed against Captain Valdez within 24 hours. The charges included assault on a federal officer, deprivation of rights under color of authority, and conspiracy to obstruct justice for his attempts to justify the assault. In his initial reports, the base legal officer, Captain Torres, was coordinating with federal prosecutors to ensure that military charges would proceed parallel to civilian prosecution. Captain Valdez would face both a court-martial and federal trial, with the possibility of serving time in both military and civilian prison. As word of the federal charges spread through Camp Meridian, personnel began to understand that they had witnessed the complete destruction of a military career and potentially the beginning of a federal prison sentence for their former company commander. The third day of investigation brought news that would reshape Camp Meridian permanently. Lieutenant General Harrison received orders directly from the Pentagon to relieve Colonel Patterson of command immediately and place the entire base under temporary federal administration, pending completion of the investigation. Colonel Patterson stood in his office for the last time as commanding officer, removing his personal items while military police supervised. His 22-year career was ending in disgrace, terminated by his failure to maintain proper command climate and prevent the assault on a general officer. Major General Roberts delivered the relief order with military precision. Colonel Patterson, you are hereby relieved of command of Camp Meridian, effective immediately, due to loss of confidence in your ability to command. You will remain under investigation for potential federal charges related to negligent supervision. The formal ceremony was conducted without fanfare in the base conference room, witnessed only by the investigation team and senior staff officers. Patterson's replacement, Colonel Angela Martinez, arrived by helicopter within 2 hours of his relief, bringing with her a reputation for strict discipline and zero tolerance for misconduct. Throughout the base, personnel watched their command structure collapse in real time. Captain Valdez was formally charged in federal court via video link from his quarters, where he appeared in military custody before a federal magistrate who denied bail due to the severity of the charges and his access to weapons on a military installation. The federal charges were devastating in their scope. Assault on a federal officer in performance of official duties carried a maximum sentence of 8 years. Deprivation of rights under color of authority added another 5 years. Conspiracy charges for attempting to justify his actions in official reports could result in additional prison time. Major Davidson sat with his client as the charges were read. Captain Valdez showed no emotion as he learned that he faced potentially 13 years in federal prison, followed by a military court-martial that could result in additional confinement and dismissal from service. "Your Honor," Valdez said, when asked how he pleaded to the federal charges, "I plead not guilty to all charges." His voice was barely audible. The confidence that had carried him through 2 decades of military service completely shattered. The federal magistrate set a preliminary hearing date and ordered that Valdez remain in military custody pending trial. The captain would be transferred to a federal holding facility within 72 hours, marking his transition from military discipline to the civilian criminal justice system. At Camp Meridian, the new commanding officer was implementing immediate changes to prevent similar incidents. Colonel Martinez called an all-hands formation for the first time since the lockdown began, addressing personnel who had been living under federal investigation for 3 days. "This base will operate under new standards effective immediately," she announced to the assembled troops. "Any incident involving physical contact between officers and subordinates will be reported directly to my office within 1 hour. Any failure to report such incidents will result in charges for dereliction of duty." The investigation team was preparing their final report for submission to Pentagon leadership and the Department of Justice. Their findings documented systemic failures at multiple levels that had enabled Captain Valdez's aggressive behavior to escalate over months without effective intervention. Lieutenant General Harrison was particularly critical of the informal counseling approach that had been used instead of formal disciplinary action. The base leadership created an environment where problematic behavior was normalized rather than corrected, leading directly to the assault on Major General Chun. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez received notification that he would be called as a witness in both the federal trial and military court-martial. His testimony about witnessing multiple incidents of aggressive behavior would be crucial to establishing the pattern that prosecutors needed to secure convictions. The federal prosecutors were building their case around the argument that Captain Valdez's assault on Major General Chun was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of months of unchecked misconduct that base leadership had failed to address through proper channels. Private Martinez was among several enlisted personnel who would testify about previous incidents involving Captain Valdez. Her account of being physically grabbed and verbally abused would demonstrate the pattern of behavior that made the assault on a general officer almost inevitable. As evening approached, word came from the Pentagon that General Chun would testify personally at both the federal trial and court-martial. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs would take the witness stand to describe the impact of the assault on his daughter and the broader implications for military discipline and respect for authority. The base personnel were beginning to understand that they had witnessed the complete dismantling of their command structure. Captain Valdez faced federal prison. Colonel Patterson was under investigation for criminal negligence, and their entire base was under federal oversight, while new leadership implemented sweeping changes to prevent similar incidents. The investigation had revealed that the assault on Major General Chun was not an aberration, but the predictable result of a culture that prioritized combat effectiveness over basic military discipline and respect for authority. The consequences would reshape how the military addressed aggressive behavior among its officer corps for generations to come. On the fourth day, 3 additional helicopters landed at Camp Meridian, disgorging the most senior military leadership the base had ever seen. General Robert Chun, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stepped onto the tarmac, accompanied by General Patricia Williams, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and General David Thompson, Chief of Staff of the Army. The unprecedented arrival of such high-ranking leadership sent a clear message throughout the military community. The assault on Major General Chun had implications that reached the very top of the American defense establishment. This was no longer just about one captain's criminal behavior, but about the fundamental integrity of military command authority. Lieutenant General Harrison briefed the senior leadership in the base conference room, presenting evidence that would reshape military justice protocols for decades. The investigation had uncovered not just the assault itself, but a systemic failure of leadership that enabled and encouraged the aggressive behavior leading to the incident. General Chun listened impassively as investigators described how his daughter had been conducting an official Pentagon inspection when she was struck by an officer whose pattern of misconduct had been repeatedly ignored by base leadership. His professional composure masked the fury of a father whose child had been assaulted while serving her country. General Williams, the Marine Corps Commandant, reviewed the witness statements with growing concern. The pattern of unreported incidents involving Captain Valdez revealed a breakdown in the Corps' fundamental values of honor, courage, and commitment. This incident challenged the very foundation of military discipline and respect for authority. We have a Marine captain who assaulted a general officer during an official inspection. We have a colonel who failed to address known patterns of misconduct. We have an entire base where aggressive behavior was normalized to the point where personnel were afraid to report abuse through proper channels. General Thompson examined the security footage frame by frame, studying the moment when Captain Valdez struck Major General Chun. The clarity of the video evidence left no room for interpretation or defense. This was an unprovoked assault on a general officer captured in devastating detail. The 3 generals met privately with Major General Chun, whose professional handling of the investigation had impressed even the senior leadership. Her composure throughout the ordeal and her insistence on following proper investigative procedures had demonstrated the leadership qualities that had earned her rapid promotion through the ranks. "Elizabeth," General Williams said, using her first name to acknowledge both personal and professional respect. "Your conduct throughout this investigation has been exemplary. You maintained military bearing and professionalism despite being the victim of an unprovoked assault." Major General Chun's response reflected her commitment to institutional integrity over personal grievance. "Ma'am, my concern is ensuring that this incident leads to meaningful changes in how we address aggressive behavior before it escalates to criminal conduct. Personal justice is less important than systemic reform." The federal prosecutors briefed the senior leadership on the strength of their case against Captain Valdez. The combination of video evidence, witness testimony, and documented pattern of previous incidents virtually guaranteed conviction on multiple felony charges. Assistant United States Attorney Henderson outlined the government's strategy. "We intend to seek the maximum sentence allowed under federal law. This case will send a clear message that assaulting military officers, especially general officers, will result in severe federal prison time, regardless of the perpetrator's military record." The investigation team presented their final recommendations to the assembled leadership. Beyond the criminal prosecution of Captain Valdez and potential charges against Colonel Patterson, they recommended a comprehensive review of command climate assessment procedures across all military installations. General Chun spoke for the first time during the briefing, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. This incident represents a fundamental failure of military leadership at multiple levels. We will implement immediate changes to ensure that aggressive behavior is identified and addressed before it escalates to criminal assault. The senior leadership tour of Camp Meridian revealed additional problems beyond the immediate incident. The base had operated with insufficient oversight of company-level leadership, inadequate reporting procedures for misconduct, and a culture that prioritized combat effectiveness over basic military discipline. Colonel Martinez, the new commanding officer, presented her preliminary assessment of needed reforms. The base required complete restructuring of its disciplinary procedures, mandatory training on proper use of authority, and establishment of anonymous reporting systems for personnel afraid of retaliation. As the day progressed, word spread throughout the military community that the highest levels of leadership were personally involved in addressing the assault on Major General Chun. The unprecedented attention being paid to the incident signaled that fundamental changes in military culture and accountability were imminent. The base personnel watched in awe as 6 general officers coordinated a response that would reshape military justice. They understood that they were witnessing history being made as the defense establishment confronted the reality that even senior officers could face federal prison for criminal misconduct. The final day of the investigation brought Captain Valdez face-to-face with the full consequences of his actions. Federal marshals arrived to transfer him from military custody to the Federal Detention Center, where he would await trial. The sight of a Marine captain in handcuffs being led to a federal transport vehicle sent shockwaves through the remaining base personnel. As the transfer was taking place, General Chun made an unprecedented decision. He requested a private meeting with Captain Valdez before the federal authorities took custody. The meeting would be brief, witnessed by investigators, and recorded for official purposes. Captain Valdez was brought to the conference room, where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff waited. The contrast between the two men was stark. General Chun in his dress uniform, bearing the insignia of the nation's highest military office, and Valdez in standard fatigues with his rank insignia removed pending trial. "Captain Valdez," General Chun began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You assaulted my daughter while she was conducting official duties as a Pentagon inspector. Your actions represent not just a criminal assault, but an attack on the very foundation of military authority and discipline." Valdez struggled to maintain military bearing as he faced the most powerful military officer in the United States. "Sir, I had no knowledge of Major General Chun's identity or position. I believed I was correcting an insubordinate soldier." General Chun's response was measured but devastating. "Captain, your ignorance of her identity is irrelevant. You failed to verify before taking physical action. You created an environment of intimidation that made subordinates afraid to report your behavior. You violated every principle of military leadership and honor." The meeting lasted only 5 minutes, but those minutes would haunt Valdez for the rest of his life. As federal marshals led him away, he finally understood that he had not just ended his own career, but had attacked the institutional authority of the entire military command structure. Lieutenant General Harrison presented the investigation team's final report to the assembled senior leadership. The document was comprehensive, detailing not just the immediate incident, but the systemic failures that had enabled it. The report would become the foundation for sweeping reforms across all military installations. The findings were damning in their scope. Camp Meridian had operated with inadequate oversight, insufficient reporting procedures, and a command climate that normalized aggressive behavior. The assault on Major General Chun was the inevitable result of months of unchecked misconduct. General Williams announced the immediate implementation of new protocols across the Marine Corps. Every installation would undergo command climate assessment within 60 days. Officers with patterns of aggressive behavior would face immediate investigation. Anonymous reporting systems would be established to protect subordinates from retaliation. Colonel Patterson received notification that federal prosecutors had decided to file charges against him for criminal negligence and failure to maintain proper command oversight. His military career was over, and he now faced the possibility of federal prison time for enabling the assault through his inadequate supervision. The base personnel assembled for a final formation under the new command structure. Colonel Martinez addressed troops who had witnessed the complete transformation of their installation over the course of 1 week. This base will serve as a model for proper military discipline and accountability, Colonel Martinez announced. The incident that occurred here will never be repeated because we are implementing systems that identify and address problematic behavior before it escalates to criminal conduct. Assistant United States Attorney Henderson held a press conference announcing the federal charges against Captain Valdez. The case would proceed to trial within 6 months, with the government seeking maximum sentences to demonstrate that assaulting military officers carried severe consequences, regardless of the perpetrator's service record. Major General Chun prepared to return to her duties at the Pentagon, her inspection of Camp Meridian having revealed far more than anyone anticipated. Her professional handling of the investigation and its aftermath had earned her additional respect from the senior leadership and positioned her for further advancement. The federal prosecutors were confident of conviction based on the overwhelming evidence. Video footage, witness testimony, and documented patterns of previous misconduct created an unbeatable case that would likely result in Captain Valdez spending years in federal prison. As the investigation team prepared to depart Camp Meridian, they left behind an installation that had been fundamentally transformed. New leadership, new procedures, and new accountability measures would ensure that the assault on Major General Chun would be remembered as the incident that reformed military culture rather than just destroyed individual careers. The base that had once tolerated aggressive behavior and informal discipline was now operating under federal oversight, with zero tolerance for misconduct. The price of reform had been the destruction of an entire command structure. But the lesson would resonate throughout the military for decades to come. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Washington was packed with military personnel as Captain Michael Valdez received his sentence. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom and across the military community as she delivered justice for the assault on Major General Chun. Captain Valdez, you have been found guilty on all federal charges, including assault on a federal officer and deprivation of rights under color of authority. The evidence presented during this trial demonstrates a pattern of aggressive behavior that culminated in an unprovoked attack on a general officer conducting official duties. The sentence was severe, but expected. 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years supervised release. Valdez would also face a military court-martial upon completion of his federal sentence, ensuring that his dismissal from service would be permanent and with loss of all benefits. Major General Chun sat in the courtroom gallery, her presence serving as a reminder of the institutional authority that had been attacked. Her testimony during the trial had been devastating in its professional precision, describing not just the assault, but the broader implications for military discipline and command respect. The federal prosecutor addressed the media outside the courthouse, emphasizing that the case set important precedents for military accountability. This conviction demonstrates that no one in uniform is above the law. Assaulting superior officers, especially during official duties, will result in severe federal consequences regardless of the perpetrator's service record or combat experience. Colonel Patterson received a lighter sentence of 2 years in federal prison for criminal negligence and failure to maintain proper command oversight. His military pension was forfeited, and he was barred from federal employment for life. The man who had once commanded a Marine base was now a convicted felon whose career had ended in disgrace. At Camp Meridian, the transformation was complete and permanent. Colonel Martinez had implemented reforms that became the standard across all military installations. Anonymous reporting systems had identified and addressed dozens of potential misconduct cases before they could escalate to criminal behavior. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, now promoted to gunnery sergeant, served as the base's senior enlisted advisor for command climate issues. His willingness to report the initial incident had earned him recognition and advancement, demonstrating that protecting institutional integrity was rewarded rather than punished. The mess hall where the assault occurred had been renovated and now displayed a plaque commemorating the importance of military discipline and respect for authority. Personnel eating there were reminded daily that aggressive behavior had no place in professional military service. Major General Chun had been promoted to Lieutenant General and assigned as Deputy Chief of Staff for operations at the Pentagon. Her handling of the investigation and its aftermath had demonstrated leadership qualities that accelerated her career trajectory toward the highest levels of military command. The federal conviction had sent shockwaves through the military community that extended far beyond Camp Meridian. Officers across all services understood that aggressive behavior would no longer be tolerated or overlooked, regardless of combat effectiveness or previous service records. The reforms implemented after the incident had prevented dozens of similar situations from escalating to criminal conduct. Early intervention systems identified problematic behavior patterns and addressed them through counseling, training, or disciplinary action before they could harm subordinates or damage institutional authority. General Chun, now in his final year as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, reflected on how the assault on his daughter had catalyzed necessary changes in military culture. The incident had been personally painful, but institutionally beneficial, forcing the military to confront and correct systemic problems that had been ignored for too long. The base personnel who had witnessed the original incident understood that they had been part of a transformative moment in military history. Their willingness to testify and support the investigation had helped establish new standards of accountability that protected future generations of service members from abuse. The legacy of Captain Valdez's assault on Major General Chun lived on in a reformed military culture it had created. His 8-year federal prison sentence served as a permanent reminder that military authority demanded respect, and that those who violated that principle would face the full weight of both military and civilian justice. The transformation of Camp Meridian, from a base that tolerated aggressive behavior to a model of proper military discipline, demonstrated that institutional change was possible when leadership was held accountable for creating and maintaining appropriate command climates. Years later, military academies would teach the case as an example of how individual actions could have far-reaching consequences for entire institutions, and how proper leadership required not just tactical competence, but moral courage and respect for the fundamental principles of military service. In the heart of that bustling mess hall, one slap didn't just echo across the room. It shattered illusions of unchecked power and ignited a firestorm of accountability that reshaped an entire military institution. The real lesson here isn't about ranks or stars on a collar. It's about the quiet courage to question authority when it crosses into cruelty, and the devastating cost of silence when we see wrong but look away. Captain Valdez thought dominance made him strong, yet his single act of arrogance unraveled a career built on valor, imprisoned him behind federal bars, and toppled a command structure that had grown complacent. Meanwhile, Major General Chun, small in stature but towering in composure, absorbed the blow without retaliation, knowing true strength lies in restraint and the system's eventual justice. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, with 23 years of grit, chose to speak up, proving that one voice raised in integrity can protect generations from abuse. This story screams to every one of us. Never let fear of reprisal mute your moral compass. Whether in a workplace, family, or community, stand against intimidation before it festers into tragedy. Your silence enables tyrants. Your courage dismantles them. What moment in your life demanded that kind of bravery? Drop it in the comments below. Share the fear you faced, the stand you took, or the regret that still lingers. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so we can keep unpacking these raw, life-altering truths together. Your story might be the spark someone else needs today.